NoDa have actually done. A huge array of different stuff, from goals from the Great American Beer Festival. Hop Drop was one of the first ones to really get them on the map, although they got in with other beers before that. But even more importantly, when we look back at what NoDa actually do for the homebrew community, we normally have the American Homebrew Association meeting at NoDa each year. Chad participates in the board chair with CBM, which the money raised goes to a nominated charity. We have the beer and branding, which is also a social event which NoDa carry out. And like today, Chad's giving up his time to come down and talk to the home brewing community. No charge, very, very welcome to do it. He's put a lot of work into presenting the information here tonight. So I think we're going to have a phenomenal educational lesson tonight. One thing, if we can hold questions off until the end, because we have a lot to go through, and this is something really, really important, and then we can ask that question there and then. And then the next slide. And here's our presenter tonight, which I thought was quite humorous.
Look at those guns.
I nearly wore that shirt tonight too. First and foremost, thank you guys so much for having me out here. One of the biggest passions I have is trying to stay true to the homebrewing roots. Myself and Todd, who is the vice president of the brewery, basically met as avid homebrewers. And essentially we homebrew still, we just do it on a much bigger pot. And can raise some money for it and everything like that. Today we're going to talk about an issue or a subject matter that I've been really kind of obsessed with for the last 2+ years. It's not a new subject. It is an extremely popular subject though, and a lot of the things that I've kind of uncovered and researched has led us to a very prominent part of our new yearly lineup, which I hopefully will get to pass out to everybody to share, if you don't have any glasses and whatnot here in a moment, which is our Radio Haze, Hazy IPA. I'm not here to sell you on Radio Haze at all. I am here just to tell you about all the different things that I kind of looked into and did research on that kind of brought me from basically not really understanding or respecting the style of the Hazy Juicy IPA to being more or less obsessed with it. One of the things with me that I'm really particular about is I really enjoy intention when it comes down to art. And one of the biggest things, the Hazy Juicy IPA category, or New England IPA category, isn't anything brand new, but it is most recently one of the biggest categories that has been accepted is for GABF and World Beer Cup and things of that nature. And it's relatively divisive. Especially when it first came into prominence. It was one of those things where some brewers were like, this is completely blasphemy, and then some brewers were like, this is the epitome of art. And unfortunately, to my own infamy, I guess, I was more so on the idea that this was kind of just a lack of artistic, just throwing stuff in and things of that nature. But then I started having some that I liked, and then I had some that I really liked. And I got really confused why it seemed like all the literature and the back and forth and banter between different brewers seemed to be very whimsical as far as how to go about making a great hazy IPA. And through some trials that we did, we made some hazies that were pretty good and I was pretty happy with, but then I was kind of fed up and was like, we need to settle down on actually scientifically proven reasons why some hazies are absolutely phenomenal and are consistent, and then some are really hazy. So basically, for the last year and a half, I've basically spent a lot of my free time and business time as well doing research and doing anecdotal research as well, and doing trial and error to basically figure out different components that I think would create this idea of a consistent, repeatable, technically sound beer that still looked and behaved like any other hazy that you would find on the market, regardless of it being 5 years ago or currently or whatever. We are very well known for our hop drop and all. We kind of just specialize in our West Coast style IPAs, and a lot of the IPAs that we've gone through in the last 8 years that we've been open tend to kind of fall into that line. We have done small batches and whatnot of our hazies, but last year and a half or so, I really kind of made a dedication to like really nailing out a lot of like the parameters to see what would work and what didn't work and what I could get away with and what was just excess, essentially. And a lot of this has been gone through seminars, a lot of it's been done through papers. I actually have at the end of the packet here, I'm sorry it's 10 pages. I did it on one side so you could write notes in case you wanted. But basically on the back end you can actually see some references. A lot of them are from CBCs and like basically symposiums that presented a lot of various studies that support a lot of the stuff that I tried out. And essentially, if you're not aware, we have two facilities at our main production areas. We have our 60-barrel main production area that has been operating for 4 years, and for 8 years we've been operating at our original facility, which is our 15-barrel system. So a lot of these like test batches I had run on the 15-barrel system and had released as full-blown limited release beers that are usually on draft, some in limited cans. But essentially, even though it would be a whole excited brand that we would put out, one or two aspects each time I would brew it, I would do a lot of detail analysis on it, do tasting panels on it, things of that nature, to see if that sort of parameter was causing a greater effect or not. So my goal today here is, again, not to sell you on our brand or on the Hazy that I have served out for everybody, but it's more so to give you an idea of what the parameters I have found have really worked well with me in our brewing experience, and also what has worked well with creating what is, from 2019, our second best-selling product, and it only had 1/4 of the year to compete in. So, that being said, I'm just going to go through different sorts of parts of the brewing process. I'm going to touch on a few things. I don't have a whole lot of stuff to draw here, and a lot of this stuff is very small in perspective. So if anything like just kind of flies over your head, raise your hand or whatever. If I get too fast in talking, it's probably because I'm getting excited about it. But just let me know and I'll try to slow down and everything like that. So starting out, one of the first things you have to look at is how are you going to do your mash, right? Now, when it comes down to grain selection on a hazy IPA, I tend to compare them to West Coast style IPAs because it's the easiest comparable style, and it's also the one that seems to be the most flipped concept to as far as the approach in the production of it. When it comes down to hazies, in my opinion personally, and that is a caveat, please, to take with all this. I'm not saying I'm the expert on these things. This is just what I've found and what I've found works really well. But I tend to think the easiest way to go about creating your mash bill, as far as the grain is concerned, is to have at least 50 up to 55, even 60% of your grain being your base grain. Doesn't really matter if it's Maris Otter or Pale Ale or Pale Malt or Pilsner. Just have at least about 50% of your grist be that, and then use the other half of it to basically be adjunct grains. You can add colored grains to it, and specialty grains to give like a little color and flair. I personally don't. I like hazies to look really pale. I like them to almost mimic pineapple juice. I think you can probably agree that when we pour the Radio Haze out, that it has that sort of appearance to it. There's nothing wrong with adding a specialty grain to it, but one of the things I have found as a benefit for doing beers that are mostly adjunct and base is that you actually, as the hop starts to fade in time and as shelf life goes on, as the beer ages, there's not a whole lot of malt character that comes out underneath the hops. So you're still just getting a less intense hop as opposed to West Coast IPAs that tend to push a lot of specialty grains out, and you get like these pseudo caramelly flavors that usually don't mesh well with the faded hop character. We've actually found that with most of our hazies, they have a much better life expectancy for preserving them to brand standard than we do for our normal IPAs like Hop, Drop, and Roll. The big thing with the adjuncts, it sounds like it's super simple, like, oh, a Hefeweizen has like 50% of wheat malt in it. Just do the same thing as that. A lot of people anecdotally say, oh, throw a ton of flaked oats in there, and that will make it really hazy. That will make it very chewy, for sure. But the actual science that's been shown through a multitude of studies is that the haze in hazy IPAs that have been super successful and are very good at maintaining their haze, maintaining their flavor, and maintaining their aroma are not due to yeast sediment being still in suspension. They're not due predominantly to protein haze. They're actually due to polyphenol oils from the excessive dry hops being held in suspension by this little guy that no one seems to talk about called prolamin. And prolamin is written multiple times through the pamphlet that I handed out. Prolamin is a protein substrate. Prolamin is available in virtually every single cereal grain, but it's particularly high in oats and wheat. Oats actually only have about 35% of their protein structures are prolamin, whereas wheat actually has up to 85%. So actually the thing that holds onto the polyphenol oils and keeps them in suspension during the full dry hopping phase and keeps it there after everything's done is actually the prolamin. And when you have high wheat content, you have high prolamin content. I'm not saying you shouldn't use oats. I use oats in most of ours as well, but I use them up to about 8 to 10%. You don't need to really go over that. They are really gummy too, and it can really make your lauter a pain in the ass. But the oats do play a factor in creating that mouthfeel that a lot of people associate to hazy. So they definitely have a role, and they will provide some proline for that binding. But my two favorite things to use for it is wheat malt and torrefied wheat. Does anyone not know what torrefied wheat is? Okay, so torrefied wheat is essentially the purist-friendly version of flaked wheat. It's essentially wheat malt that's been puffed, so it will, when you run it through a mill, it will give you a similar effect as throwing flaked wheat into it, but you don't have to keep throwing, in our cases, bags and bags and bags into it. So if you're doing it on a homebrew scale, you can just use flaked wheat too. It's totally fine to do. The idea though is that adding that flaked wheat and adding that wheat malt, you're gonna get a really high proline character to it. You're gonna have a lot of protein substrate in there, and then the oats can also really benefit with mouthfeel and some head retention as well. Also, when it comes down to the mash, you want to look at your water chemistry, and everyone gets excited when you say water chemistry. It's a snooze fest sort of subject matter. But with us in Charlotte, we have a very neutral water source. We do filter it out, and we basically add water salts to every single batch that we do, and we adjust the water salts on what style we do. The funny thing with the hazy IPAs is according to most of the studies shown on the majority of the tested hazy IPAs that were done from Dr. May at Hopsteiner, is that the calcium chloride and the sulfate or gypsum, the sulfate or gypsum concentration were almost flipped of what a standard West Coast IPA was going to be. So with a West Coast IPA, you tend to want to go about 300 to 400 parts per million on sulfate, and you do about 80 to 120 in calcium. That's because sulfate's really good for increasing isomerization in alpha acids, so you get better bitterness for your buck. It also is very briny, and when you drink a sharp West Coast style IPA, you want to have a good nice pop to the end of it, and that kind of helps facilitate that in the water profile. Chloride on the other end gives you a chalky character, so you tend to go higher on that with beers like oatmeal stouts and things of that nature. So with hazy IPA, you're not going for a high bitterness level, or typically you're not. Most brewers don't, they want to go with low bitterness. So the alpha isomerization is not really important. Also, you don't want excessive brininess because you want it to be really smooth. So instead, we actually are flipping it, and they recommend usually between 200 and 300 parts per million of calcium chloride and about 80 to 150 of sulfate. With us, with this beer that we passed out, I do about 320 chloride and I do about 85 sulfate. So that nerd stuff's out of the way. One thing to also add when you're doing these, I know it sounds like blasphemous, but rice hulls are really nice in this situation. So we don't do a protein rest, right? We don't do a protein rest because of all the protein substrates we want to carry over to the final beer. I want them intact. Like I want to make sure that they are in full display and they can cling on to all the polyphenol oils, so we don't really do a protein mash itself. But I do mash relatively high in the saccharification range though. I try to go for a mid to high alpha saccharification. On every one of the beers I've done, the lowest I've done is 154. I tend to actually do most of them now around like 156, sometimes even 157, which is pretty high. The reason why that's important for those that are stepping into the all grain levels and whatnot, you can have saccharification anywhere as low as like 145, 146, all the way up to just short of 160. On the low end though, you're doing more beta saccharification, meaning that if you, I'm gonna use a chart, this is sweet. So, meaning that if you have a starch chain like this, beta saccharification breaks the chain off at the tips, which makes these little tiny sugars pop out. That's like popcorn to the yeast. They will gobble it all up and you end up with a really dry beer, which is perfect for a drier IPA or perfect for like a Saison. If you go on a higher temperature, the alpha amylase breaks it off deeper into the chain, leaving these longer chains of sugar, which is like T-bone steaks, to the yeast. Therefore, you're left with more residual sugar. Again, it works for the style. With this, that sounds like it'd be obvious to go with the style, but it's actually more important than you think because of a phenomenon that's been recently a kind of a hot topic called hop creep. Who here's heard of hop creep? Nice, all 7 of you. That's great. So, not to kind of go a little bit deeper now, I'm sorry, but I have these two charts up here. So hop creep happens when you dry hop a beer. Hops that are thrown into that are used as dry hops have a diastatic enzymatic reaction to the wort, which basically means they have enzymes in them naturally occurring that will break down starch chains further. If you have yeast still active, even subtly, they will see that as a new food source unless they're completely stressed out and just saturated with alcohol. So what you end up getting a lot of times, let's say if we had like a West Coast style IPA, Here's the density of Play-Doh, here's time. This would be the normal fermentation curve with it, and it would bottom out. If you dry hopped it in there, all of a sudden you've got extra fermentation happening, and it dries out a little bit further and takes forever to clean up. And might, if you packaged it in that time, would turn into a diacetyl bomb. When you're doing a hazy IPA, you tend to dry hop extremely early, if not on the very first day of fermentation, which means the fermentation profile would normally do this, but the reality of it is that since you dry hopped it early, its hop creep is still in effect, so it's going to fall the same line, but just go down further. But the cleanup time is much faster. So if you if you mash in a higher temperature, you give yourself a better chance to not dry out so severely that you end up with this really dry, astringent, and overshooting your alcohol level of a finished product. Essentially, you're just trying to maintain the fluffiness and the mouthfeel through a lot of elaborate graphs. So that's the mash. So going forward onto lautering. This is a lot less detailed on lautering. How many are all grain brewers here, by the way? Nice, awesome, cool. Lautering is really nothing that significantly different from a normal, any other beer. The only thing that you would have to really do is, again, rice hulls is really important to add to the equation to make it not a complete nightmare. And the other thing is, don't try to make your runnings look ultra cloudy. When it comes down to making hazy IPAs, they should look cloudy from a combination of deriving polyphenol oils in conjunction with biotransformation with yeast that then settle out, and those polyphenols and prolamins are left over in the final product, okay? Yeast is not the thing that should make your beer cloudy, and also junk from your grain should not be making your beer cloudy. That gives you lots of chances for tannin and astringencies. There's actually kind of an anecdotal thing that a lot of brewers I've talked to have said that when they're making their hazy IPAs, they want the cleanest looking runnings they can get because it somehow turns out hazier than what they expected it to be. I do a normal boil off when I do it. I run a moderate rate over. On our big system, we run about a 17 to an 18.5 gallon per minute, which sounds fast, but we can run it to like 20 something gallons per minute. The only other thing that's kind of note with the lauter is that if you want to add first wort hops, I think this is a good place to do it because basically when we're in the boil, there's almost no brewers I know that add a significant amount of hops to boil. Because we have so many different IBU perceivable factors going into the dry hopping side, we want to keep IBUs low. So the first wort has a nice subtle back-end character to it. I like to do it on a lot of the hazes I do. Radio Haze has a very small charge. It's like 8 to 10 IBUs in our first wort, which is done with Chinook. And I think that's nice to kind of give a finishing end to the hop character instead of having the beer disappear as far as hop profile when you drink it. So that's the lager. There's nothing that crazy about it. Just do all the normal things you would do for it. Don't try to make an exception for the fact that it's a hazy and try to throw the cloudiest wort that you could ever have in the kettle. All that physical material is just going to burn up, and you're probably going to have tannic sort of character after the fact. So, I don't even know where I'm at in the page. There we go. I'm not trying to read this verbatim. I'm trying to talk about it. If like a lot of the stuff, if I run through it, there's a lot more spelled out in here. So with the boil length itself is not a critical thing. Whatever you would normally feel comfortable about boiling, do that. Like a lot of people want to boil all their batches at 90 minutes. Some of them want to do 75, some want to do 60. I think that really is depending on how vigorous of a boil you can achieve. With us at our 60 barrel system, we have an internal calandria. It looks like an internal explosion going on. It's a super aggressive boil. For most of our beers, I don't need to boil more than 60 minutes. If we choose to go to a Pilsner malt as the base, I would boil for 90 minutes just to get a little bit of DMS or the corny character out of that. But if you normally boil for 75, boil for 75. If you normally boil for 90 or 180, however you want to do it, do what you would normally do for adjusted for your system. The only thing that I would say that's kind of unique to the hazies versus a West Coast style IPA is that you want to have hot side hop additions down to a minimum. So when I was talking earlier about having a lot more IBU perceivable factors in the finished dry hop, this has been a huge contention in the brewing science community, and to the point that we almost I personally want to be away with the entire IBU calculation altogether. Essentially, when you're doing hazy IPAs, you can easily put into a beersmith or a calculator all the hops that you're throwing in there, and it'll come out with saying, you have 2 IBUs in this. and you drink it and you're like, hell no, that's not 2 IBUs. So basically, when you're dry hopping super early and you're having this huge interaction with fully active, high Krausen yeast with fully exposed dry hops that you're throwing in there, you're getting perceivable bitterness from beta acids that are being oxidized. You're getting xanthohumol that's going to contribute to it. You're getting humulone that's going to contribute to it, and even the breakdown of myrcene are all going to contribute to things that we would call bitter, but no bitterness calculation actually attributes to. So if you're throwing even subtle amounts in the kettle to add to IBUs, your IBUs are going to go pretty high. Now, if you want to make a big, giant, bitter, hazy IPA, that's fine. Throw them on in there. But if you're trying to make a kind of a stereotypical, smooth, rich-bodied, all flavor, very little bite IPA, I would be more inclined just to say skip the boil for any additions in general. After the boil is done, I mean, I don't know how many people actually can whirlpool here, but you can kind of call this the same day as like flame out. I do like a small amount of flame out or whirlpool hops to be done. In our production system, we do about 1/4 pound per barrel, which is a really small amount compared to a lot of our other IPAs. It just gives some like kind of mid-palate hop flavor to the beer itself. I don't think it really overpowers it as far as IBUs are concerned, but you still want to be subtle with it, because going a little bit too far in conjunction with all those other things that are going to happen with the fermentation, you can easily overpower the beer with IBUs. We use Mosaic in our whirlpool for rating rates for what it's worth. The big thing that comes in now is the fermentation. So fermentation obviously is important for beer, because otherwise it's just sugar water. I think the best thing you can do with this is just pick a tried and true hazy IPA yeast. I have a few listed down here. Our first and foremost, my favorite yeast to do with this is the Y Yeast London Ale 3. It's a beast of a yeast. It's super, didn't even need to rhyme that. It's very dependable. It has done extremely consistent fermentations with us. It is also a yeast that's not very flocculent, so it does stay suspended, and when all those prolamins binding with polyphenols are anchoring down, that yeast is all around it, beating up and causing a biotransformation that's going to give us the flavor and the aroma that we're really looking for. White Labs London Fog is pretty good too. It's extremely cloudy. I've had some inconsistencies with that in the past, but it does work too. The Burlington Ale yeast works pretty good, which is kind of another version of the Conan yeast. I think it works totally fine. The White Labs Coastal Haze is also a newer variety that's been out. We don't currently use it because it does contain the ST1 gene, which shows positive for diastaticus, which is an infection. So when we're doing our micro testing, it would basically null and void that every time. And we love London Ale 3 a lot, so why change it up? Also, the Omega Yeast Tropical IPA yeast has got some really great reviews as well. So I listed a few down there that I think would be fun for you to try out. When it comes on to fermentation temperature, I've tried a wide range of different fermentation temps, and a lot of these yeast are advertised as having like this nice estery character to them and whatnot. From personal experience alone, almost every sort of thing that I would call an ester, I would have attributed to a hop characteristic. So I think that if you're trying to make a traditional English style ale or something like that, these yeast would present some sort of an estery, subtle character to them. But when you're throwing tons of hops on top of them, that's not really that important. So usually I just try to ferment at a pretty tried and true fermentation temperature, usually around 67 to 68 degrees. When the beer is about 70% of the way through attenuation, so let's say if we started out at 14 Plato, let's say we start at 1052 gravity. And it's looking like it's gonna finish at a 1010. By the time it's around like 1020, I would ramp the temperature up to like 74. Mostly because all the ester and phenolic profile has already been established at that point, and it just kind of speeds the yeast up so you don't have to wait forever for it to clean up with diacetyl. That's what we do on ours. The big difference at this point that comes in is the dry hopping. So dry hopping, when it comes down to the West Coast style IPAs, which is like we show right here, one of the big goals that a lot of classic brewers would do is they would just basically wait till the yeast was done and then dry hop it at the end of the fermentation. This way there isn't a yeast interaction to begin with, so you're not getting an additional hop creep, you're not getting additional potential BDK/diacetyl predecessors that would come out of it, and you get complete, full, intact oil complex of the hop. The West Coast ideology of dry hopping is essentially, this hop smells like this, I want that to smell in my beer. That's essentially what it is I want to take this flavor and I'll put it in there, and they basically have found the right rates and the right temperatures to do so to get the most extraction out of that exchange. There's a 2007 Craft Brewers Conference symposium where they had a panel of like 12 of some of the nation's biggest IPA brewers, everyone from like Russian River to Stone to New Belgium and those guys, and they asked them all how much did they dry hop, and the amount was so low it was like staggering. It was like everyone was like, that can't be the rates, and they were all like between 1/4 to 3/4 of a pound per barrel, which is really small. A lot of brewers now do at least a pound per barrel, if not higher, all the way up to 2 pounds per barrel. But the idea is that they already can get the ample amount of flavor they want from dry hopping when everything's basically finished in fermentation. Hazy Juicies, as they are the complete opposite of that. So we're dry hopping it immediately. I actually did some tests where I dry hopped a beer as I was knocking out and split the batch over and then dry hopped the next beer on the first day of fermentation and dry hopped the beer after that on the second day of fermentation. No discernible difference in flavor profile whatsoever. The only thing is the one that was 2 days later wanted to explode on me pretty hard. So I don't recommend that if you want to keep half the beer. The other thing I would recommend is I would not recommend dry hopping while you're actually knocking out. It's super convenient. You have no eruption factors. The problem is though, is you're introducing a product that's not completely sterilized in an area that's trying to propagate yeast up. So if your yeast doesn't completely take, there is a chance that you could have a microbe take a hold and start competing against your yeast. So my rule of thumb is basically as it's starting to come into high carousing, that's the best time to throw the dry hops in. One, it gives you full contact time when you have high activity, and two, it just makes it easier for throwing a bunch of dry hops in without it having all the CO2 backed up with it and having nucleation sites that are going to erupt on you. So in the dry hop, the goal for the Hazy Juicies is completely the opposite of what I just said with the West Coast. Where it's like, I like how this hop smells, I want that hop to be in my beer. The majority of the hops flavors, let me wipe this down, sorry. The majority of the hops flavors comes from essentially, this doesn't work at all. The majority of the hops flavors, and when it comes down to dry hopping especially, are established from essential oils, right? And essential oils, there's a variety of them. One of the most predominant ones is myrcene. There's no single oil that is directly responsible for one singularized flavor. They're very delicate things and they work in conjunction with each other to make these realized ideas of the actual like hop aroma and flavor itself. So myrcene is one of the biggest ones you'll find. Most West Coast grown hops that are typical for hazy and for West Coast style IPAs are anywhere between 35 to 65, 70% of their hops oils can be of myrcene content. So I'm just gonna put them up there for the myrcene. It can be anywhere between 35% to 70% of the whole complex. And there's a lot of other oils in there. So you have like other oils like caryophyllene and the rest of it. So it can be anywhere between like 10 and 30%, right? This guy is attracted to yeast, and you throw it in there with the yeast as it's fermenting, it's going to be drug out. Because even though these yeast are not very flocculent, they will eventually flock out. They will eventually separate, and they're going to take myrcene with it. So if you're depending on the 2 big cofactors or 3 big cofactors on that hop flavor, you're missing one of the biggest pieces right there. What has made the Hazy Juicies super popular is the biotransformation that happens from these little tiny, no celebratory oils that are they're in there, like geraniol and linalool, which gets a little bit of love. 4-MMP, which if you guys want to read that out, you're welcome to, and nerol. Hops that are high in geraniol, you might be lucky to get about 3% of the whole oil complex is geraniol. Geraniol by itself smells very flowery, so it's like kind of like a rose almost, and a little tropical and citrusy. Linalool is very tropical, and you might get up to about 4% in the oil complex of linalool. 4-MP is even lower. They frequently won't even tell you how much 4-MP is in the hop. If you're like doing a crop selection, you won't get that stat. And nerol is even lower than that, but you're looking at anywhere between like 1 and 3% for both of those guys. But what happens when you guys introduce these to yeast, instead of dragging them out of suspension like you would get with myrcene or caryophyllene, or breaking down into like cohumulone into almost like a bittering component, these guys form into really cool stuff like beta-citrulline and various terpene structures and things that literally resemble almost picture perfect, like on a chemical level, a grapefruit extract or an orange extract or pineapple extract. And all of a sudden, after doing hyper analysis and all these really successful hazy IPAs, they're like, those giant oils aren't important anymore. These little tiny guys that are only accumulating up to like 10% of the entire complex are literally carrying the entire flavor and aroma development of these hops. And that, in point, proved why we dry hop our beer with 75 pounds per barrel works, because they're so tiny, you have to throw a huge amount of them in there in order to even perceive those biotransformed characters. Now, I've listed a bunch of different hops on here for you guys as a reference. We have on, I think it's the second or third last page, but like Geronimo rich hops, we have like Aurora, Cascade, Bravo, Centennial, Chinook, Citra, Motueka, Mosaic. Linalool is Citra is one of the highest Linalool hops. I actually have them in descending order. So the ones that are listed at the beginning are really rich in those hops, and they tend to be really high in those hops. You can put these guys in all sorts of different combinations and get all sorts of different fruit byproduct combinations that follow after it. And basically for the last year and a half, I've been picking my dry hops not by what is the sexier named hop, but by which hops are fitting most of the parameters that have high content of the oils that I want to manipulate, which is hard to do because a lot of them, like I said, they don't even list what the 4-NMP and the Neurols are at. So that's why the Neurol list is pretty low. But you can see, so the hops that we use in Radio Haze are Citra, Mosaic, Centennial, and Chinook. And if you look around between all those categories, you'll find one of those guys in each one of them. And you can take any one of these combinations of hops, and you can make all sorts of different sorts of fruity flavors by throwing them in different proportions and letting that biotransformation take hold. The dry hopping amount is also very important. Like I said before, you have to throw a lot in order to perceive it. From a bunch of studies, it's basically been accepted in the last year and a half, 2 years, that you have to throw about 3-ish pounds per barrel, or I have it actually broken down per 5 gallon in there somewhere. Where's that at?
2.6 ounces.
Thank you, 2.6 ounces per 5 gallons of a rate in order to actually perceive those sorts of hops. But the big caveat is you have to be throwing in hops that are high in those sorts of little oils. If you throw just any hop that's just like, this one looks good, and it doesn't have a lot of Geronimo, it doesn't have a lot of Linalool, it doesn't have a lot of 4-MMP or Neurol, even though you threw 4 pounds or per barrel of it, or whatever that ratio would be for 5 gallons in ounces, you still might not perceive that because it still has to have a certain threshold of its oil complex, have enough of those little special oils that are going to actually biotransform into those super flavorful characteristics. I'm sorry, I keep getting dry on the throat. It's so cold outside, I'm shaking. So basically, that's the way you need to kind of program it in. When we do the Radio Haze, we dry hop at 3.5 pounds per barrel. I definitely do think there is a point in which there's diminishing returns. I've done batches that were 7.5 pounds per barrel that only smell slightly more intense than beers that were dry hopped at 4 pounds per barrel. So I don't think you need to just constantly add more and more and more. And when it comes down to efficiencies, that's really irresponsible because you're throwing tons of, throwing tons of vegetable matter essentially into your beer that's going to give you tons of sedimentation. You're going to lose a high percentage of your beer if you just keep chucking hops into it. So basically, after the year and a half of finding all this out, we came up with Radio Haze that sits at 6% alcohol. And I was able to find out the things I had to have in it, such as the torrefied wheat, the wheat malt, an acceptable amount of oats, the right water profile for it, the right dry hopping rate for it, the right kettle hopping, or neglect that, or rate for it, the right type of yeast. And essentially, this beer was able to clock in at the exact same cost level that we use to produce our hot drop and roll. So we produced this beer as a year-round beer, not just a one-off. That was the exact same price that we had as our flagship beer. So you could choose whether you wanted the New England style or the West Coast style, and you didn't have to pay a difference between the two of them. A lot of times, a lot of these awesome hazy juices that come out, they do go so heavy with the stuff that they know that works that you have to pay 20-something bucks or more for a 4-pack or whatnot. And I was like, those are great, and we will still release those types of beers too, but I wanted something that was consistent and year-round that we could replicate over and over again. And when it comes down to the actual haze component with it and the whole polyphenols being held in suspension, the beer that was passed out to you guys, that's the centrifuge beer. That beer actually goes through clarifications through our centrifuge the same way that we put our hot drop and roll, our Cavity Blonde Ale, our jam session, and it still comes out pouring like pineapple juice. And we have cans from the very first run, which was about 5 months ago, and they still haven't fallen any haze out whatsoever. So when you do these sorts of parameters, and on the last one I have kind of the summary of the main topic points for it. If you at least follow those points, I'm sure you'll make an awesome hazy IPA, and you can have fun trying all the different dry hopping properties and stuff. So, hope that was at least a little information on that. Any questions? Yes, sir.
So, two-part question. With your water profile, is that considering 7 pH? I'm looking at his pH wise, right?
Right.
Is that considering your pH as a neutral 7 pH, and then you're adding?
No, we have it stock profiled on my Beersmith, and I just plug it into the water calculator there, and that's how I come up with the parts per million on that. It's not completely 7. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head, but we check it like every 2 months. It varies very minorly. So basically, whenever I plug it in, I can basically put in the stock profile and everything. So we also get reports from the city, and I can plug that in, and then I can just add in whatever I'm going to throw into it, and it gives me like my parts per million out of it.
Gotcha. Then my second question is dry hopping at high Krausen. I found that dry hopping for more than 3 days usually gives me more of a bitterness and less of aroma.
Right.
So like I usually try to dry hop less than 1 to 3 days is my dry hop maximum.
Right.
So like if you're dry hopping at high Krausen with 2.5 ounces per pound,
Yeah.
2.5
For
ounces
5 gallon.
yeah, for 5 gallons. Like more than at high Krausen, I'm looking at it, with a prop of the active rest and everything else like that. So I guess my question is like, at high Krausen, if I'm dry hopping, should my rest time go down? Or
It should, yeah, it should, because it's not in the hop creep effect is essentially happening the exact same time that your fermentation profile is happening. It's just basically contributing more breakdown it's basically making more things for the yeast to eat. So what you find is instead of it like lingering forever, it's just already converting. I'm sorry, the other graph's not here. But it's basically already happening while it's eating down, so it will just dive bomb further than what you would normally calculate. It does make a much faster VDK cleanup. Do you know how to? Does anyone here know how to do an at-home like diacetyl proofing test? It's actually the easiest thing you can do without like having to buy a lot of equipment. Just get a jug of anything that you can seal that is can take hot temperatures. Take a couple ounces of a sample of a beer that you think is done, and throw it in a hot water bath that's like 150 degrees for roughly 45 minutes. And then cool it down just so it's easy for you to drink, and then just smell and drink it. If you smell or taste diacetyl, let it sit for longer. If it's clean and doesn't taste like it has any diacetyl in it, it's good to go and crash, basically. That's how we do every one of our beers. We do run them through a spectrophotometer to get an actual number behind it, but we do sensory on every single beer as well. And Radio Haze finishes off easily about a week and a half before Hot Drop and Roll would.
And for the new people, what does diacetyl smell taste?
So diacetyl is that butter smell. Is it butter or fake butterscotch? Diacetyl is actually part of what they squirt when you squirt on your movie theater popcorn. So that tastes just like that. Only tastes good in Harry Potter universe, I guess. And VDK is visceral diketone. VDK is going to be produced whenever you make alcohol. And VDK, if it's presented with heat and or oxygen, which is like if you have it in high amounts and you go to transfer it into bottle or whatnot, you may not taste it right then, but as you transfer, you're going to pick up some oxygen. Anytime you move beer, you're going to pick up oxygen, and you're inevitably going to expose it to some heat, and eventually, weeks down the road, diacetyl will form from that VDK. So if you basically force heat it and force oxygenate it from taking a sample on it, and then you still can't taste diacetyl in it, there shouldn't be enough VDK in there that even weeks down the road, that you should perceive any of the diacetyl that could come out of that VDK and basically just break down. But as far as the bitterness side is concerned, that may be an issue with the dry hops themselves. Like I said before, there's a lot of other cofactors in there when you're dry hopping early that contribute to a bitterness experience that's not calculated in just I threw this much in at this time in the boil. So that might be an issue with the hops themselves, or an exposure issue, because beta acid levels are way through the roof when you look at hazy IPAs. For the longest time when we were doing West Coast, I was like, I don't understand why every box of hops is throwing the beta acid percentage on here. Like, we almost never care. We always look at the alpha for computing IBUs. But when we started doing hazies, like, this actually does play a big part in what the actual finished out perceived bitterness is going to be. But I would try it at least a couple of times with the highest Krause, and we don't get any excessive bitterness on it finishing out. That's not what we would expect it to be, at least.
Dry hopping length though, like
yeah, we go through the whole
1 to 3, 5 to 7.
When we do the dry hopping, when we shoot it in a basically a can. So it shoots into the fermenter, and it we don't have like a secondary fermentation vessel. It all stays in the fermenter. Once it's cleaned up, we crash it and we rack it off the true pile, and it goes into the right tank and we package it from there.
Is it a t-shirt cannon?
So what? No, it's not a t-shirt cannon. It's called a hot bag for reasons. It's a big dome that's on wheels. It holds like 7 barrels of fluid and has a big paddle in it, so you can flood beer into it, add dry hops to it, and then the paddle will break them all up. And you can look through a window and see that they're broken up, and you pressurize it and it shoots it back in. You just do that a bunch of times, especially for Radio Hazy, we do it a whole lot.
And can I borrow it?
You can fit it in a truck.
I want to shoot hops everywhere.
Yes, sir.
I'm a new brewer.
Yeah.
Do you have a simplified recipe that works for homebrewing?
Yeah, I think that the easiest way to look at it, on the very last page, there's those little kind of highlights that are in italicized. If you try to do, if you're not doing all grain, you can just simply use the wheat malt and the oats as a steeper bag if you want, and then just simply rack over to the volume that you would do, wait to add hops maybe at the flame out, and then dry hop the first day after you see you have activation in it and use the right yeast in it. That's the easiest way that's the most streamlined way to do it. I wanted to kind of explain a lot like the reasoning behind it here, and I know that it heavily, well, it's more so there's a lot of contradictory concepts to what the West Coast style of doing it would be, and I wanted to give reasoning why instead of just being like, this works really well. It actually has reference to a lot of people smarter than me doing a lot of studies on it. But essentially, if you're dry hopping with the right type of hops, and the list of those hops, like if you pick any one of those and they're relatively fresh, they're probably going to give you a good amount of what you're looking for. And I put in there a couple of times too the dry hop rates per 5 gallons in ounces, because I'm used to thinking everything in pounds per barrel. But essentially, if you just do if you look at having at least about 40% of your sugar components being from those adjunct grains of wheat and oats and things of that nature, you should be able to get enough proline in there to bind to the hops themselves. And I just wouldn't add any hops during the boil for 60 minutes. And then once you get in the fermenter and you see that you have yeast being really active, whether it's the very first day after you do it or the next day after that, as long as you see a good amount of activity going, throwing a good hefty amount of those types of hops into it should be able to give you something close to it. No problem.
So how long did you homebrew before you became a
About-
famous brewer?
That's very subjective. About 5 years or so, 5.5 years. Doing 4 batches a week on average.
Chad, can you run through that test you said you did one more time?
Yeah, the BDK test, essentially just get a small bottle of something that can just stay hot, so it's not gonna melt. Get a water bath. What actually really works great with this, and my lab, my head of lab will be here next month to go over some of this stuff too, Anthony Proctor. We actually use a sous vide. You do like a little water bath with a sous vide and just set the temp to like 150 degrees and just let it run in there for 45 minutes and then take it out, put it in a little ice bath. All the ice bath does is just make it so if you drink it doesn't burn your mouth. That's essentially all it is. Now there will be funky flavors and aromas in that because you basically just took a beer that might still have yeast suspension in it and you basically just boiled that yeast alive. But the idea is like if you smell butter and you taste butter and you get that sensation of the slick, like buttery character on it, then there's obviously too much BDK to go through. One of the practices that's really common with homebrewing is, and I used to do it like crazy, is like we'd wait to see bubbles, the bubbles would stop, and it's like, well, next month I'll rack it over. And it's like, by that point, like you're in the clear more than likely. But you don't really have to wait that long. Most of our ales, they fully attenuate in 4 to 6 days when they hit terminal, and within 3 to 4 days after that, if they're not dry hopped later on, then they're ready to basically crash and packaged off. Like if you don't need to wait an excessive large amount of time. But at the same time, if you want peace of mind to know that you're about to transfer this beer over, you're about to cold crash it, or however your packaging procedure goes, if you want to just know, like, yeah, I don't think there's any risk of diacement, you can simply just get a few ounces in a little container, heat it up, and if you have any questions on it, let it sit another day or two. Yes, sir.
So, if you're saying minimize all the hops in the hot side,
Yep.
do you really need to boil it? Obviously on a commercial scale, it makes a little more sense from an efficiency standpoint, but on the homebrew scale,
I think you need to boil it, one, because I think it's gonna guarantee that you're gonna kill any sort of organism that's ambiently gonna be on the yeast or would have gotten in it through the brew day. Also, I think it's important to boil it because if you already have a standardized procedure for calculating what your original gravity is in conjunction to your boil, you go and do that just for the sake of consistency. So I think, and also if you're doing a first wort, if you're doing Whirlpool's not really that ultra effective on it, but if you're doing a first wort or something that's trying to give this little subtle back end, the boil is also gonna contribute to that as well. Also, boil does boil off DMS really heavily too, so that's a big part of it as well. Yeah. Yes.
So does a stall on gravity necessarily mean your dactyl rest is done? Or can you have a stall on gravity for a few days and then, do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah,
so
no,
I'm using a tilt.
Yeah, no,
I'm using a tilt and-
we don't ever test our diacetyl rest at all until we've had multiple days of it being stalled. So if you have activity going down if it's still attenuating, if it's still like dropping gravity, it's producing BDK. Like it's making the predecessor for diacetyl right there, and it's only after once it's stopped attenuating, and it actually takes a couple of days because like the yeast is still active, but they're out of their feeding phase essentially. So they've made all the alcohol they want, and they're going to basically go through what we call cleanup. And part of that cleanup is them absorbing and breaking down the diacetyl, or the diacetyl predecessor in BDK. So if you see a stall in your gravity, that's fine. Let it stall. That's okay. I wouldn't test it until you've got at least a couple days where you've had a stagnated attenuation.
That's a question.
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry if you covered it already, but
Go ahead.
have you tested grossly under pitching?
Under pitching? Nah, we don't, just because we don't really under pitch anything besides our Belgians. But there is a part of the so there's a big generalized idea that a lot of the yeast that are done for the hazy juices, like the London Ale 301, like oh, they're such strong, awesome yeast. And I agree, they're awesome yeast. But I think a big part of the dry hoppings that's done, one, you have that diastatic enzymatic reaction that's going to break everything down and making it easier for them to eat. But also there is evidence shown, and I'm not saying this is law, I've just talked to a couple of hop representatives about it as like kind of like a theory, and you know, if they know anything about it, we just kind of have loose conversation. But FAN or free amino nitrates are a huge part of what the wort content is that goes in, and that feeds a lot of the yeast propagation. There's been evidence that there's increased FAN activation from early dry hops, and there's a kind of rumbling of like a theory that may actually cause hyperpropagation in the yeast itself. So I've heard anecdotally a lot of people saying like, oh yeah, I only pitched like, you know, half of what I would normally pitch and still took off. I definitely think there's some clout to it. We just tend to, if we don't need to have like partially pitch, we just don't do it. We grow up all of our own yeast and pitch them, you know, at the adequate amounts for each one, because I'm mostly trying to look at, you know, the repetibility of it and everything like that. But I think it's definitely something to play around with, and especially with the yeast that have like more predominant ester productions and stuff like that, you could definitely see maybe some additional underlying flavors come through from a little bit of a strain on it. But if it's not a Belgian, we don't really underpitch any of those. Thanks. Anybody else?
Other questions?
I just have a question about the water chemistry.
Yes.
Water chemistry.
Yes, sir.
I've made a couple of New England IPAs. I've been playing with water chemistry. And the first one was not very salty.
Yeah.
And I thought my chloride was too high. So I
Right.
lowered it. The second one was better.
Right.
But I went from 200 chloride to 150 parts per million.
Right.
350. What do you know what the chloride is in your hazy?
Yeah, it's like 320. It's really high. But again, it's one of those things where we have almost no salts in our water to begin with. That helps. But also the chloride from, you know, I personally perceive like the gypsum being more the pseudo salty, the briny sort of character, whereas chloride to me always accentuates like mouthfeel for our stuff. It is technically a salt, so that is, like calling it salty is not incorrect. But our tasting panel has never looked at the chloride levels being higher as being a brinier or saltier perceived beer, and I think that is mostly due to the fact that we have such a blank water profile that we can throw that much in there and it can skyrocket it up. I also with stuff like that, one of the biggest things with water salt chemistry is as long as you have that calcium ion in there to facilitate with mash extraction because it assists with the amylase breakdown, like that's the principal thing. After that point, I think going on your own perceived flavor profile of what you like in the beer is more important than what like the city like numbers are back to you and whatnot, and then going off of the really finite numbers and whatnot. I've been playing with it simply because it was obviously a factor that's shown up in studies that like it's an inverse of what the West Coast were, and we don't have any salty bryness. But if you're experiencing it, I would just keep it dialed down. Anything between like I said, like the 200, 300 is what they recommended from the testings that Dr. May did. But again, with us having such a blank water source on it, it just works quite well for us to just throw pretty heavy on it. And, yes, sir.
Yeah, I bottle condition.
Yes.
All these late edition dry hops, how does that affect any kind of sugar additions?
As long as the yeast has done what it's done, then the sugar that you put in there after the fact should just be the next step for them to eat. The dry hop additions just break down what is in the wort that's not already broken down further. That's the diastatic enzymatic reaction. When I keep saying diastatic, I'm sorry if y'all don't know what that is, but like when you see diastatic or diastatic, it's essentially referring to breaking starches down further. That's it in a nutshell. So when you have it in the wort, as you would dry hop, you're going to break down starches that are still available to be broken down, so you could get additional yeast fermentation with it. But if the yeast is done eating that, if you then rack it to bottle and you put a little bit more sugar in it and even a little more yeast, if that's something that you would do, it should just be eating that sugar. So it shouldn't, in my opinion, it shouldn't affect the bottle conditioning other than what your normal rate would be, as long as you didn't like move to bottling too early. Yeah.
One more question.
So making this Radio Days into a milkshake IPA,
Yeah.
would that just be adding more unfermentable fruit sugar?
Yeah, you could just do some more lactose in it, and vanilla bean, and all the other catchwords that we're recording all. But yeah, so I'm actually trying to make a milkshake IPA called my milkshake brings with all the bros to the yard. I don't know if I'm getting approval for that name yet or not, but it will be like a peach vanilla lactose milkshake IPA.
That's just adding unfermentable fruit sugar?
Yeah, so lactose is too complicated for Saccharomyces to eat. Brett can eat it, but unless you're throwing Brett in the beer, it should basically stay unfermented. So even if you throw some like a mild amount of lactose into it, like you could still increase your mouthfeel without it going all the way to like milkshake level. But essentially, the extra lactose is too complicated for Saccharomyces to eat on its own. So you would have a higher final gravity and therefore a sweeter, more full volume beer.
What a rock star.
What a rock star.